Today we're talking about rhetorical criticism. I'm Peter Perry. By rhetoric, we don't mean empty rhetoric, as it's just someone's talking, trying to make noise or flatter. It's not just manipulation with words. Instead, rhetoric is the art of persuasion. And by that, we want to ask, how do people persuade others to hold different attitudes, values, and practice different beliefs? Rhetorical criticism analyzes a text, in this case the Bible, as a means of persuasion. It looks at first a speaker or writer who is in a specific situation in front of a specific audience and trying to instruct, move, or delight this audience towards specific goals. And here again we mean values, attitudes, beliefs, and actions. Let's spatialize this as a speaker that's in a given situation with a given audience, a very specific audience, and has certain goals that then propels the speaker to make this speech. Take Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, 7 years ago. Lincoln is at the dedication of the military cemetery at Gettysburg in the Civil War, and he's speaking to soldiers, families, and reporters. And through these reporters, he's speaking to the whole country. And he's trying to move this union to continue the fight, especially for the values of equality and democracy. There are many different kinds of rhetorical criticism. For this class, we're going to use what's called historical rhetorical criticism, which uses ancient textbooks and actual speeches from the ancient world that are contemporary in time and space with the New Testament in order to understand the strategies that people used at that time to persuade one another. One of the most well-known in our time handbooks is Aristotle's Rhetoric. And from Aristotle's Rhetoric, we learn about the means of persuasion. First, logos, the argument from reason; pathos, the argument from emotion; and ethos, the argument from character. Now, in every speech, in every act of persuasion, all three of these are at work, even though a particular author or speaker may be relying on one more than another. Each of these three means of persuasion correlates to some aspect of the rhetorical situation that we described earlier, the speaker, the audience, and the speech. In this case, logos, the argument from reason, correlates to the speech itself, the order and structure of the speech, the premises or the logical reasoning that are presented, the commonplaces that everybody assumes to be true, the examples that are given, the illustrations that are used. And when we're analyzing the logos of a speech or a text, we want to ask, how can I boil down the reasoning behind this text into a single statement? For example, let's take a look at Paul's letter to Philemon and boil the situation down in terms of reasoning. What are some logical statements we can use to describe this letter? The first logical statement is that Onesimus is Philemon's runaway slave. Second, Philemon has the right to punish or reject Onesimus, and now Onesimus is returning to Philemon, and Paul is concerned about Onesimus' well-being, so therefore Paul must intervene. This is the logic behind the situation. Now, what's the persuasive argument that Paul makes? Paul argues Philemon is Paul's brother in Christ, and Onesimus is Paul's brother in Christ. Therefore, Onesimus is Philemon's brother in Christ. Now, this reasoned argument explains the order of the letter, that Paul emphasizes his relationship with Philemon as beloved, co-worker, and brother. Second, then he presents Onesimus as his child, and now Philemon's brother, before Paul then asks Philemon to treat Onesimus as if he would treat Paul. And then Paul logically addresses the objection that Philemon may be owed money because of something that happened to Onesimus. This reasoned argument also explains the word choice, that Paul chooses to emphasize family language. He uses this play on words of Onesimus' name, which means useful, with a play on useless, that Onesimus is useless to Philemon as a runaway slave, but is useful to Paul and Philemon and the whole church as a brother in Christ. The second means of persuasion is pathos, or the argument from emotion, and this correlates to the audience. The audience always has an emotional state. The audience is never a blank slate when a writer or a speaker speaks to them. And so the author or speaker must try to address those emotions and change the emotions in order to achieve transformation. Aristotle lists a number of continuums to understand emotions, and we need to understand that all emotions have some kind of value persuasively, that you may want someone to be angry and righteously upset at injustice in order to motivate them to act. Or you may want them to be serene and peaceful in order that they are not offended by something. For example, it is somewhat surprising that Paul does not address Philemon's potential anger at Onesimus by trying to move him from anger to serenity. However, that might have been a strategy that Paul would have wanted to use. Aristotle also describes friendship on one side and enmity or hatred on the other, fear on one side of a spectrum to confidence, shame on one end or honor on another, kindness, the feelings of kindness towards someone, or unkindness, pity of someone who's hurting or been taken advantage of, or indignation, hatred of them. Envy, that means wanting something that someone else has, or imitating someone else. These particular emotions are especially relevant for us in our study of the New Testament because they offer a window into how the ancients, especially in Greek, understood emotions and how to use emotions to persuade. Let's look at Philemon again and describe the persuasive argument in terms of emotion. First, Paul uses honor language to counteract possible shame, the shame of not punishing a runaway slave. He honors Philemon as beloved and a co-worker. He thanks God because he hears of all his love. He's trying to move Philemon from the shame of this runaway slave returning to honor. If Paul tries to honor Philemon in front of the community, he also uses a bit of shame to try to help move him in the direction Paul wants him to go. He talks just hinting that he could command him to do his duty, but that he wants him to do this voluntarily, not as something forced. And he wants him to welcome his runaway slave as if he would welcome Paul. He then hints that he could invoke that he owes him even his own self. Now, he hints here, it seems, because he doesn't want Philemon to feel the resentment, the full-blown shame. He just uses it very carefully to help prod Philemon in the direction that Paul wants him to go. We've already noted all the love language in Philemon. Paul calls him beloved and so forth. And by love, we really should see this as kindness, as if to family. We can see how Paul is trying to evoke a family feeling by his language. He talks about Philemon's love for the saints, that is, the hospitality he has extended to other Christians as if they are family. He's trying to move Philemon from feelings of unkindness towards Onesimus to feelings of kindness. First, starting with others that Philemon has shown this kindness to, and then including Onesimus in the group that Philemon normally had been showing this behavior motivated by the emotion of kindness. Here, rhetorical criticism in the analysis of pathos helps to explain why Paul gushes over Philemon at the beginning and uses similar language to encourage Philemon at the end of his argument. It explains why Paul emphasizes family language and love, and it explains why Paul avoids talking directly about Onesimus as a runaway slave. And finally, this emotional analysis helps to understand why Paul only hints at the shame of rejecting Onesimus as if it would be rejecting Paul, that Paul certainly could have deployed. Paul could have began his letter by saying, if you reject Onesimus, you're rejecting me, but Paul is more careful than that, and this emotional analysis helps to understand why. The third means of persuasion is ethos, the argument from character, and it's the character of the speaker that we're talking about. It correlates to the speaker in the situation. This argument motivates the audience by affecting the evaluation of the speaker and the speaker's self-representation. This completely depends on the extent to which the audience believes the representation presented by the speaker. So let's look at Philemon and describe the persuasive argument in terms of the speaker and writer's character. An analysis of ethos always begins with the prior state of knowledge of the audience to the speaker. Here we know that Philemon knows Paul. Paul was the one who evangelized him, and so Paul already has a high status in Philemon's eyes, which means that this is the trump card that Paul has, that he can always say, I'm the one that evangelized you, you have to listen to me. But to play it too harshly risks resentment. Yes, Philemon may do it if Paul just says it that way, but he'll only do it because he says so, and Paul hints at that he could do this, but he doesn't want to play this. So, first, he puts Philemon on the same level as himself. He is a co-worker, he's my brother. Paul presents himself as equal to Philemon. And then Paul even lowers himself down. He refers to himself as a prisoner and an old man. He puts Philemon up at a higher status. Philemon's not a prisoner, Philemon's not an old man. But then Paul hints at the trump card that he could command Philemon to do this. But he doesn't play it entirely. Instead, he slowly raises himself up above Philemon, referring to Onesimus as serving Paul in your place, as if Philemon should be serving Paul. But then he backs off and says, no, wouldn't do anything without your consent, again putting Philemon in control. Next, he identifies Onesimus with himself. Welcome him, Philemon, as you would welcome me. Onesimus is dead as my dead. And then he flashes the trump card without playing it. He says, I say nothing about you owing me even your own self. See how he shows the trump card but doesn't play it. And then he ends by putting himself above Philemon. Refresh my heart, confident of your obedience, he says. Now, this argument from character, this analysis explains why Paul begins by identifying with Philemon on the same level, but ends with Philemon obedient to Paul. It explains why Paul identifies with Onesimus. And it further explains why Paul minimizes the fact that Philemon owes him and why he doesn't play that trump card except for flashing that he has it in his hand. Cicero was a Roman politician and orator before the time of Jesus, and he talks about in his book on oratory 5 tasks of the orator. Invention is the one that we're most interested in for this class because it's during the phase of invention that the author or speaker figures out the purpose, the goal in speaking, or in this case for the New Testament, writing, and considers the audience, thinks about the audience. What is the state of the audience, especially the emotional state of the audience, and how do we want to move the audience? And then the author, speaker begins to think about all available arguments from reason, emotion, and character to build the best possible speech. Ask the question, which will be most effective to reach the goal? Using some things and not using others. After going through this phase of invention, then the author thinks about what order and style is most effective. And finally, memorizes the speech. Memorization was so important in the ancient world. It was a part of schools, and memorization of the speech was preferred for maximum self-control, and that way the speaker could adapt to the audience because the speaker had such control over the speech. And finally, then the 5th part or 5th task of the order is to deliver, perform the speech. Quintilian is perhaps the 3rd of the 3 great teachers of speech and rhetoric in the ancient world, roughly contemporaneous with Paul. And Quintilian writes, memory provides the order not merely with the order of his thoughts, even of his words, nor is its power limited to stringing a few words together. Its capacity for endurance is inexhaustible, and even in the longest pleadings, the patience of the audience flags long before the memory of the speaker. This again emphasizes the importance of memorization for good speeches and good presentations. So imagine Onesimus bringing Paul's letter, he's the most likely one who did it, standing up in front of the congregation, in front of his former master, and reading it, probably by memory. Just think of the social pressure that creates on Philemon to do what Paul is asking. For this class, we're only going to be analyzing the logos, pathos, and ethos of the texts we study. We'll be doing an online exercise of Paul's letter to the Galatians, and we want to ask, what is his argument from reason? What are the logical steps that describe the situation, and also then describe his argument? What is the emotional state of the audience that he is writing to? And how does he try to adjust and change that emotional state? What does he do to create a certain representation of himself? And how does he change throughout the letter to the Galatians, how he presents himself and how the audience thinks about him. For further reading on this subject, I suggest you read George Kennedy, which is posted on eReserves, or you can check out Margaret Mitchell or Hans-Dieter Betz's books in the library. God bless you and your day.